I'd like to introduce Andrew McAllister. He's also been integral in the Active Efficiency Collaborative in his role as co-chair of the Strategy Committee. He was appointed to the California Energy Commission in 2012 by Governor Brown, and he oversees the state's energy efficiency efforts. We're lucky to have him today to join us to lead our panel on beneficial electrification. Andrew, over to you.
Great. Well, Clay, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly.
All right, great. Well, thank you. I mean, boy, we all need to give Clay a big round of applause just for being the fearless leader here of many of these parallel and reinforcing complementary and essential efforts to really move our energy systems to a decarbonized future. So thank you, Clay. Just amazing how many plates you keep spinning. So I'm really happy to be here. This has been just a great effort all around. I have to give kudos to Natasha and the whole team at the Alliance who really supported this effort. And then all of the folks on the steering committee and the working groups and just all the thought leadership that this has inspired, I think has been impressive and just very, very valuable and will continue to be so. So I'm happy to be a part of it. You know, in California, we've been thinking about these issues perhaps with slightly different terminology, but I actually think that the effort here at the national level, broad-based, that the Alliance has put together has helped connect a lot of themes, really tie up threads in a way that is very understandable and digestible to the broader marketplace. And so I'm very excited about that. Beneficial electrification is, as the previous panel, Michael and Natasha, that conversation was great because I don't have to define beneficial electrification, that laid it out. And just all of the modern technologies that we have to enable our devices down to the device level to participate in the grid and support reliability and keep costs down, decarbonize, and enhance reliability. All three of those things are essential. And we have the tools now in the digital age with modern technology that can integrate all of these various functionalities. We have technology that can do that at scale, at low cost, to help our energy system decarbonize all at once. And so it's really a tremendous, perfect alliance of developments, really. So I wanted to just take a couple minutes to talk about this from my perspective, just a few sentences, and then I'll introduce the speakers on this panel, which I'm very excited about. In California, we're doing a bunch of things along the lines of what Maine is doing. And I think we do have some relatively deep authority as a state, which allows us to innovate. And so one of those areas is load management and developing rate structures and rate regimes and tools to do sort of prices to devices that we can implement and kind of push into the marketplace relatively quickly. And so we're in the middle of that now. We have time of use rolling out across the state. We'll get to more time responsive pricing over time here in the next few years. And that will really enable the marketplace to innovate. Our electricity rates are higher than Maine's. Our bills aren't generally higher than average across the nation because our climate tends to be mild. But there's a very nice signal at the margin for people to automate demand responsiveness, load flexibility, so that it can actually enhance grid reliability, decarbonize, and all of these things that we need active efficiency, beneficial electrification to do. And that the second thing that we have authority to do now is to develop and require eventually load flexibility functions in our appliances. So sort of something parallel to appliance efficiency, which we've been doing since the 70s, but actual load flexibility functions independent from efficiency in our appliance stock. And so over time, we'll be pushing those functions into the marketplace at massive scale so that when the grid needs, has a congestion problem or has some kind of a stress problem, that actually will have access to load flexibility as a resource to enhance grid reliability. So that is, both of those complement each other and they're very exciting. And then we do a lot of R&D. We have the building code that actually we're increasingly putting storage requirements into, load flexibility requirements into. So all told, the conditions are there to really scale what we're talking about as we electrify to decarbonize, we can do it in a way that's beneficial to the grid and society at large. And so I'm super excited about that. And our four speakers here have perspectives on this, and I want to introduce them. I'll go one by one. I want to just state their names and give you the order, and then I'll introduce them with a sentence or so as they come up. So David Terry is Executive Director of NASEO, the National Association of State Energy Officials. Keith Dennis is the Vice President for Consumer and Member Engagement at NRECA, the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association. Regina Montalbano is the Technical Services Manager at TRC Companies. And Ed Barbour, finally, is a partner at Guidehouse. So with that, I'll introduce David briefly. David and I have worked closely together for years. Thanks, David, for being here. I've been on the NASEO board and just stepped off of my role for being as chair of the NASEO board for a couple of years. It's really been among the most gratifying things I've done in my career. And I have to say, having been on a number of nonprofit boards, NASEO is just right at the top in terms of the quality of the engagement and the support that it provides to its members. So thanks, David, for being here, and I'll pass it off to you.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. And thanks for the kind words. It's because we have great members, frankly, and great board members. So makes the difference. Just a few quick words building off of, I think, something you said and Michael said with regard to beneficial electrification. NASEO's representation of all the state energy offices and the variety of energy conditions, climate interests out there has meant we've taken a long view on energy and environmental and climate issues. And by that, I don't mean a slow to act, rather long view as in thinking about the implications. And I think the importance of GEB or grid interactive efficient buildings, active efficiency, and optimization of the grid to enable so many of the decarbonization strategies that are out there, including beneficial electrification, is a central point for us. Those are important components in the portfolio to make this work well. We saw some of the benefits of thermal load beneficial electrification early in initial work that Maine and other states were doing that had natural gas constraints, for example, and certainly it's rolled well beyond that into other areas. I think the place where we have not so much caution, but a need for data and analysis and work, and probably done at a faster pace than is reasonable, but we need to do it, is around the implications of the electrification choices that we make from a cost perspective and equity perspective. And I think that grid interactive component or ability to load shift goes hand in glove with that. It's going to enable those possibilities. So I think that sort of is the highline comment that I would make, except to say that we see these activities and interest in every region of the country. In most of the states, there are places where electrification, particularly the thermal residential load, can make sense or is a part of the policy arsenal that's being created or used for climate reasons, for cost reasons, a variety of activities. I guess the last thing I would leave with to keep my kind of beginning remarks brief is the work and collaboration that we found, not only with the Alliance to Save Energy, which has been tremendous, and the members there, our affiliate members at NASEO, certainly our state energy offices, but also the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners. We have a joint NASEO and NAREC committee on grid interactive efficient buildings, of which electrification is a part of the conversation and a growing part. So I think that's another thing that will help us succeed, help us help the energy offices in every region facing different options and grid needs, and reliability being at the forefront along with climate. So I will pause there in the interest of time, but that's sort of the opening overview of how we're addressing beneficial electrification, at least in the residential sector, certainly much more robustly in the transportation space.
Great. Well, thank you very much, David. I'm looking forward to the conversation, and thanks for keeping it high level so we can get to some Q&A in a little bit. So next is Keith Dennis from NRECA. And all full disclosure, I worked in the International Programs Division of NRECA for about a decade, but earlier in my career. And I'm very familiar with the co-op model and just all the benefits that it brings to vast swaths of our country. And how critical it is to development of our electric systems and to moving to beneficial electrification as kind of an idea and in a practical way that's implementable. So Keith, take it away. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you. I work at the National Rural Electric Cooperative Association, as Andrew mentioned. We are trade association of the 900 co-ops that cover over half the landmass. I'm also the co-chair of the Beneficial Electrification League, which is a group that really works on beneficial electrification exclusively to kind of promote that idea and to enhance the market. I've been involved with the term beneficial electrification from the start back about 5 years ago when we were defending the use of the term, and now it's everywhere. But I want to spend a couple of seconds just talking about the idea of beneficial electrification. I know it was touched on earlier. The term beneficial electrification is really a term of art in the industry, and it's important to understand sort of why that term is there. One of the questions that we get, especially from the co-ops, where electrification is really in our DNA, and the benefits of electrification in general are just so obvious. Not having to wash things by hand, having light bulbs in your house, things like that. So one of the questions is, isn't all electrification beneficial? And the answer is, it really depends on who you ask and what they're trying to achieve. I guess, for example, you could say, if I had a propane furnace or a natural gas furnace in my house, somebody who is really interested in the environment and if we're in a low carbon state might say, you should switch out that furnace for an electric heat pump because it will reduce carbon emissions. But if that furnace is relatively new, that could cost me a lot of money. And I might say, hey, that's not beneficial to me as a consumer. I'm going to be spending a lot of money to do that. Likewise, if I want to save money and put something in that's really inefficient, it could save me some money, but it might be bad for the environment. It might increase the CO2, especially if you're in a high CO2 area. And that wouldn't be good for the environmental community who might have an interest in electrification. We could electrify every EV on the road. If everyone was charging at the peak, it'd be a big problem. We'd have to build new power plants and we'd have all kinds of grid congestion. If we're doing it off peak, it might have a different scenario. So that idea of grid and active efficiency is important. And quality of life is important too, because we could certainly save money and help the environment by giving people products that don't work as well. And on the flip side of that, one of the reasons to do electrification may be because you want to enhance your quality of life. You want something that's electric because it's less noisy or creates less indoor air pollution or anything like that. So we have this big, broad kind of concept of beneficial electrification that's a subset of electrification that talks about saving money, helping the environment, reducing grid impact, and improving quality of life. And as long as you're doing one of those things without harming the other ones, there's a large group of folks who will say that is beneficial. You know, I'm saving money, not harming the environment, or I'm helping the environment, I'm helping the grid. That's beneficial. And it becomes like a public good in a way like energy efficiency is, where there's no reason not to do it. And it's something that you can get behind. So it's not an electrify everything concept. That's a little bit different of a thing that might be kind of at all costs to electrify anything. This is really trying to find that balance that brings that big tent in. The co-ops have been really involved in this. We've had state meetings in 9 different states so far with the support of the statewide associations and environmental groups that are local. We've done Electrify Alaska, which we just finished, and Murkowski spoke there as well, Senator Murkowski. We did Electrify Colorado, New Mexico, Iowa, Wisconsin, Virginia, North Carolina, and Indiana. And so that's really brought a great local stakeholder groups. Actually, in Colorado, they started a chapter of the Beneficial Electrification League, and I've been working closely with the state energy office there. So there's a big movement afoot. The next thing that we're looking at is how to talk to consumers, because this is a great idea and we're all policy people and we kind of get the idea of beneficial electrification, but a consumer is the one who makes the choice about what product to buy. And it's really important to figure out how to speak to them. Some folks might be open to an environmental message. Some folks might be open to cost savings, but it's really important to figure out what the next step is. So with that, I'm going to pass it along back to Andrew, and I look forward to questions later.
Great. Thank you very much, Keith. I appreciate it. And really exciting stuff happening. Totally agree with that. And so we're going to move into a couple of folks who have a lot of implementation experience working with companies and actual clients doing projects and a lot of analysis about buildings and processes. And I'm really excited to have them on the panel as well. So first is Regina Montalbano. She is at TRC Companies, which many of you will know as a leading consulting firm on these issues. She's a PE and has deep experience with distributed energy resources and buildings. And so I'm really happy to welcome you, Regina, to the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew, for the nice introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. Like Andrew mentioned, I was going to spend a couple of minutes just talking a little bit more about the implementation aspect of beneficial electrification, and specifically some of the experience that we of TRC has had. We, as Andrew mentioned, are a nationwide implementer of demand side management programs, and we've been implementing beneficial electrification programs and measures easily since 2017. So out of that, we have borne a lot of program experience kind of on the ground and seeing kind of how some of those consumers that we've been talking about are reacting to the beneficial electrification concept and are kind of taking that call to action. So first, kind of stepping back a little bit, just wanted to touch base on, what beneficial electrification means in terms of implementation. And I think when a lot of folks think about this, they think about the, common definition of more of a fuel switching type of opportunity. But in our experience, we've seen a lot of success through some other pathways to beneficial electrification, one being for new or added equipment loads. That's either on the residential sector or the C&I sector. And another pathway, which is more focused on comfort optimization. And I think that comfort optimization pathway is pretty interesting because it is more about supplementing some of the existing equipment with electrified or electric equipment to, again, improve some of that occupant comfort. So some examples might be in a home, supplementing a furnace system with a heat pump that is perhaps dual fueled, which then can provide some more of that demand flexibility while helping to navigate some of the peaks and valleys of the heating and cooling needs of that home. Right now, in the implementation space, a lot of these beneficial electrification measures are covered under some of the umbrellas of the existing energy efficiency program structures. And while that does provide the opportunity to pursue beneficial electrification out there in the market, it does prevent us from getting, I think, the levels of traction that we perhaps could, and essentially ends up limiting the adoption and overall benefit to the environment. I think when you look at the energy efficiency program structures, we are leaving behind some identified opportunities in cases, especially when beneficial electrification projects or measures do need to achieve energy savings through the fuel switching pathway. Sometimes that just leaves opportunities behind that you cannot serve. Also, when it comes to energy efficiency programs and the traditional frameworks for evaluating their cost effectiveness, we do run into a little bit of a challenge when it comes to not only the frameworks that are used to value the cost effectiveness of a program, but the valuation methods for the inputs to those frameworks. It's very, very difficult to quantify some of those non-energy benefits that we all know exist from beneficial electrification opportunities. And, some examples that we have just from being out there and working on the field, supporting customers as they're making the switch to electrified equipment is, and one example is a forklift or a tractor that was being used to aerate a pond. One small farm customer thought that was the best way for them to provide that aeration, and some of these programs were able to go in and help them install an electric aerator to that. How do you quantify all of the benefits around that? That's a very, very difficult subject to breach. And I know that's something that utility program implementers and policymakers are considering as we make this shift to carbon reduction based programs. Keeping all of that in mind, and looking at some recommendations that we may have for some policymakers to consider as we broaden this approach and try to gain more traction of adoption for beneficial electrification is, again, trying to broaden some of those objectives of the energy legislature to be, holistic. And I know a lot of areas of the country are already doing this. But in that vein, also maybe trying to broaden some of the tax credits that exist for beneficial electrification. Right now, there are a lot that are offered for electric vehicles and solar installations, but perhaps opening that to some more beneficial electrifications that can happen within homes or other commercial and industrial facilities would be good. Finally, I think, allowing some of those existing program frameworks to not only deliver savings for today, but help use those engagement opportunities with those energy consumers to set the path and set the pace for the years ahead, which will require, as a critical path item, beneficial electrification of a lot of equipment loads. So what I mean by that is, allowing within current program structures, the opportunity to take advantage of that engagement, and for example, creating EV ready homes, upsized electrical panels and the like, which are currently kind of baked into some of the codes and standards that are coming into play, but can be furthered along by the adjusted frameworks for some of these energy efficiency programs and legislation. And with that, Andrew, I'd like to turn the panel back to you.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Regina. I appreciate your comments. And we have one final speaker, batting cleanup here, is Ed Barbour. Hey, Ed, how are you? All right, great. Thanks for being with us. And, I think, your broad experience at Guidehouse is really great for sort of vacuuming up and maybe picking up some of the details that that we have to get a complete view of this topic, and then really looking forward to your comments, and then segueing into a little bit of Q&A to link up the various themes that we've heard and that you'll present. So thanks for being with us.
Great. No, thanks, Andrew, and thanks for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. It's always tough to be the last before we open up the question and answer, especially after following three great speakers. I'm just going to add a couple quick comments. I'm very excited about the potential for beneficial electrification, particularly in the buildings and the transportation sector. If it does happen, we are going to see some significantly increased electrical consumption, in the future, whether that's 2040 or 2050. And already we're seeing many of our customers, for those who don't know Guidehouse, we work both within the utility sector as well as private sector and manufacturers. So we're kind of touching on a number of different stakeholders associated with beneficial electrification. And all of them are actually thinking about and analyzing all the different complex impacts that it can have on capacity, transmission, distribution needs from the grid standpoint, from product adoption within buildings, and then on the transportation sector in terms of electric vehicles and how they're actually going to be implemented. If you look at grid impacts and think about beneficial electrification, things to consider as you develop policies or look at solutions are that it's really going to be dictated by local conditions. And so that's going to be your building stock, your grid infrastructure, as well as your current demand profiles. And those are going to vary by region, state, and even at the local level. So policies and technology adoption will likely have to consider all of these variables and be tailored to those. So, for example, loads such as electric water heating, electric vehicles, they can be spread out, through the year. They're going to be fairly consistent. And ideally, you can move those to off-peak times. While seasonal loads such as space heating are going to have an impact on winter peak, and certainly in colder regions, that's going to be a peak they haven't experienced in the past. As many of you know, the electric grid in most U.S. regions is designed for summer peaking. So when we add this additional winter demand, it's going to pose some issues, depending upon the existing system and climate, and those just have to be accounted for in terms of designing those technologies and policies. For this to have a positive impact and really be that beneficial part of the electrification, we're going to really need those grid interactive technologies. Things such as GEB, I think David Terry mentioned earlier, grid interactive efficient buildings, as well as just newly adopted technologies that allow better grid management via a number of ways: load shedding, load shifting, thermal energy storage, variable capacity, and above all, they have to be able to communicate with grid networks. So if we can do this in a manner that is truly beneficial, it's going to have a positive impact on utilities and consumers. As an example, if this is designed properly and we're able to actually handle the peak load, any peak load impact, consumer rates could actually decrease with increased consumption, as we've been able to address the peak demand issue. So we were able to take the same fixed costs and spread it over greater sales. And that ensures that the loads are actually managed properly and with increased resilience as well. We haven't touched on resilience, but hopefully resilience for utilities as well goes up. So these are just some of the considerations. I want to get to the question and answer. I know we only have a few more minutes. That are needed in the careful planning and adoption of policies and technologies. And as I'm last, I guess I hand it back over to Andrew and look forward to some questions.
Great, that was perfect. And the utility tie-in, I think, is great. Is a great segue to the first question that I wanted to ask. And I guess this is partly self-serving because it's a debate that we're having now in California about grid reliability, but perhaps it's for you, Ed, and also for Keith to start. And that is, we have these load-based resources. They can be, as you implied and stated, they can be for load shaping, sort of routine load shaping, but they can also be for event-driven kinds of needs in the grid, right? And so I guess we're having a discussion in California about how to sort of have it both ways when you need those resources in an event-driven, when you have a capacity constraint or whatever, N-1, or if you just want to do daily load shaping to optimize the use of your grid. And I guess I'm wondering, if you have any thoughts, either of you have any thoughts about the latter, so the sort of capacity market role, resource adequacy, capacity market kind of role for these aggregated load flexible resources that we'll see much more of as we beneficially electrify.
Well, I'll just talk from a cooperative perspective. You can imagine, an owner-based electric system can find ways to manage costs that other places can't. So historically, you may know that the co-ops have had these water heater programs where collectively the co-ops help their members to buy water heaters, put them in and say, as long as you control them, you can have a lower rate, and we'll use that for management. I think that's been a little bit of a precursor to what we're seeing now with more renewables and more opportunities for electrification, especially to help lower income and more folks lower their costs. That there's no reason why that can't be brought to other industries. And for example, I was just doing Electrify Alaska, where they have big components of hydro that's only available a certain amount. They have big canneries. There's places where you have big agricultural loads. They can turn on and turn off, and you can manage rates with them to say, we're going to do this, give you certain deals at this time and certain deals at that time in order to manage this. And I think it becomes even more exciting when you think about things like hydrogen production or storing energy in ammonia. These types of things where you can really use this low cost renewable energy at a different time. Now, whether or not that needs to make it to markets is a different situation. I think it depends regionally, and it depends on the structure you're in. But the technology behind it's the same, and the economics behind it's the same. It's how do you unlock it? That's really the question. And I do think there's roles for different models to do that directly or through markets.
Great. Yep. Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, I mean, I would say just everything he said, and I think the ability for these technologies to be resources back to the utilities I think is quite substantial. We really haven't tapped into a lot of that. And that's going to require understanding. I think David talked about the research on cost, but also on operations, right? How can you decrease consumption based on grid signals, and what does that impact is, and how can we create storage, not just thermal, but maybe also battery if we can tap into the electric vehicles and longer term, how can we tap into that and make buildings or vehicles a resource for a utility? And so that it's going to require different business models, likely, different controls in order to be able to communicate between the two. But the technology, much of the technology is there. And so it just becomes a time to try to implement and do it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm incredibly optimistic about being able to, use these aggregated resources, have, digital communications, bidirectional, obviously with customers' assent, but really aggregate and load in and get the appropriate level of visibility at the balancing authority, say, or the dispatch, and statistically evaluate it to make sure, yes, you can confirm that it actually showed up and can be a resource. And so I think that there's a lot of beneficial electrification is opening up huge amounts of opportunity there. And I guess I wanted to also ask, and this is for any of you who've been working with the actual equipment suppliers, that would definitely include Regina, and I think David at the state level, thinks about this as well. The OEMs, so what do they need to be able to produce, heat pumps and other technologies that have the right communications and control modules in them that can actually enable them to plug and play in this in this new regime, right? If there are prices to devices, well, how are the devices hearing and operating and responding to those signals? What's the challenge for the OEMs and the equipment landscape?
Andrew, I'll take a quick stab at that. I think there are several things, some of them a little in the weeds, but I think some of them bigger picture. In the weeds, for example, I think we still have work to do on controls, for example, in multi-fuel source residential settings where we may have a propane boiler and a low temperature heat pump or something like that. We still have a few issues to get past, I think, in that regard. But as a general matter, it's more market guidance, I think, and a surety, which is what I think Ed and Keith were hinting at. In the policy landscape of that, I think the energy offices are well suited to help deal with planning around some of these complex issues where you're thinking about load from electric vehicles and changes in building energy codes and dealing with climate policy. And I think those come together in kind of I think they'll ultimately in most places come together in kind of a magical way that do positively impact costs. I just couldn't help but think as I was listening to Keith talk about the water heaters. Back on the farm in 1972 in Ohio, where I grew up, we had a remote controlled hot water heater. And I think since we were teaching slide rule use back then, I'm confident that the technical pieces are straightforward if we offer good market guidance. And not to say that there aren't any, we certainly have refrigerant issues to deal with and so forth and code issues. But my sense from talking with NASEO affiliate members that are in this market in a variety of ways, vehicles, thermal load and cooling and heating, it is more market guidance and certainty that they're looking for and good data points and consumer education, which I think we're all pretty well suited to do, and we need to find a way to accelerate that process.
Great. Anybody else?
Yeah, I would agree with what David said. I think a large piece of that is the market guidance, and I think that's where some of these initiatives can leverage some of the existing customer touch points that current programs already have. I think some of those relationships with the OEMs and companies and such really does help further that. And the more outreach, education, and awareness that we can build will help further the trajectory.
Great. Well, thank you. I guess maybe there's a complimentary question about how do we get customer benefit out of this, right? If we're going to rely on customers, and Keith, you mentioned this, rely on customers to provide some kind of a supply resource. How is it uniquely through rates, or is there some other way where we're like with solar and net metering, say, as an analog, we provide customers with an explicit value proposition somehow, different models for that, if you have any thoughts quickly on that.
Yeah, well, it's certainly not only rates. The example that I give, the water heater, if people don't have enough money to buy one, if you can buy one for them and they don't have the $500 to $1,000 and you can finance it and then just say it's just going to be controlled, super easy for you. We'll bring somebody there to fix it for the life of the product. They might not need a rate to do that. So it's tough when you get sucked into a rate conversation when it's really a technology conversation. I think things need to click. We have a lot of people trying to find proprietary solutions, and that causes a little bit of problems with the technology. Do you do power line carrier? Do you do Wi-Fi? Do you do a gateway? And someday I think it might click with like an Alexa or something, and you'll just have a person that can say, I want my home to be on cost saving mode. I want my home to be greener. This home should be greener because we're going to give them this much money. And it will just sort of find a way to figure things out. And I think once we get there, we'll have consumers as a better resource. And I've been waiting for it to click for a while, but I think the technology is getting to the point where it could. If you got some signals from the grid and you got the technologies to interact, you could have a seamless greenhouse, cost-effective house, comfort house, and certain modes that you put in, and you could rely on that, I believe.
Great, perfect. All right, anybody else want to comment on that? Great. Well, I guess I wanted to maybe pivot a little bit to really, I guess, helping understand how our sort of traditionally we think about energy efficiency, programs, and how those can how those do or don't compare in terms of the social benefit piece of it. What programs we just heard about Maine, for example, that really is dedicated to the heat pump conversation. What parts of this have could fit into a program environment like maybe what Keith, so let's take the resistance water heater conversation and move that over to heat pumps. you're talking potentially a larger investment. You're talking sort of a little bit more complexity, perhaps. Hopefully not too much. Do our existing programs and kind of regulatory regimes for supporting efficiency translate well over into this beneficial electrification space? Maybe we could start. I don't know if Regina, you have any ideas about that, but I'm kind of thinking you might.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew. I think in general, the way that energy efficiency programs do approach project implementation does support it. However, I think there needs to be several modifications to allow for beneficial electrification. In my remarks, I talked a little bit about, shifting some of the cost benefit frameworks. For instance, within a lot of utility programs, we're seeing a shift from, a reliance on cost effectiveness tests of the TRC test, total resource costs, over to the societal cost test. I think that's a good switch that will help further beneficial electrification. But again, I think one of the biggest missing pieces is how can you quantify some of those non-energy benefits so that whichever cost effectiveness framework you use can show clearly what the benefit is to all of the consumers and all of the ratepayers and customers who are contributing to the funds. So I think that there is a lot of goodness that can be leveraged and borrowed for beneficial electrification. I just think there need to be some modifications.
Great, thanks for that. We are getting some questions from the audience here, and I'm trying to kind of sort those through in real time here as we're discussing. There was one question about the load flexibility and what I referred to. We had a bill called SB 49, which gave the Energy Commission authority to actually require load flexibility in appliances. So that could be HVAC, heat pumps. It could be any number of appliances. And EV, we're looking at EV chargers, and even the list is long actually in terms of the potential for that. But it does, it doesn't have sort of federal preemption issues. And so we're excited about that for the long term. It's a marathon, not a sprint. We have to develop, test procedures and actually have, okay, here's what load flexibility looks like in detail. So that we're on kind of the front end of that, but the authority's there, and we're pushing as hard as we can on it to develop that infrastructure and hopefully work with other states eventually to get this, to be a more broad-based thing and really move the marketplace to build in load flexibility. So hopefully that answers that person's question. This is for David. Have you looked at the thermal mass storage pilot supported by DOE in New York City, 1 million square feet of office building, reducing peak demand?
I haven't kind of looked at it in any depth. I have read a little bit about it. It certainly looks interesting, but nothing in depth. I just wanted to add that I do think, this is a space where we don't get many free lunches, and optimization of the grid and greater utilization of it at off-peak hours is one of those. And I do think that's a piece of that, our policy framework, thinking back on Regina's comments that I certainly agree with. We still have policy and certainly regulatory constructs that are rooted in using less energy, not necessarily less emissions. And I think that's another problematic piece of this puzzle that we have a great opportunity to solve. It's a good news story if we cast it that way. I think certainly thermal storage project is another aspect of the marriage of these technologies together.
Yeah, I totally agree. And a couple of you, I think, mentioned cost reductions in load shaping and seasonal issues. Really, we've always, long term, those of us who've been in the electric sector, we understand that capacity factor, load factor actually matters in terms of getting our unit costs down, and that hasn't changed, right? And we have now these new tools to help that happen. I guess I'll ask folks for just some final comments. We have just a minute left. And maybe if there's any just burning thing you want to, actually, we're not talking about combustion, I guess, but you know what I mean. Final point that you want to make, sort of top level takeaway. Here's what we need to focus on going forward to get the most out of beneficial electrification.
I'll just mention one thing. This is active efficiency, and I think that energy efficiency, active efficiency, beneficial electrification, I don't even think they're cousins. I think they're really all really close to the same. They're not energy conservation, but they're very close. The economic barriers are very similar: lack of information, externalities, and even a heat pump water heater. That's energy efficiency, or it's beneficial electrification. It's just reducing emissions, saving costs, doing something better, and with the same or less, with the same or more output. And so I think that these funding opportunities and the programs really are going to look a lot similar. And it's almost like a little bit of a rebranding, given the fact that we're sort of in a carbon constrained world where there's new stakeholders. And so I hope we can move forward with the same zeal that we have with the efficiency.
That's a great point. I'll invite each of you quickly if you want to, if you have some top level point, have a sentence.
Well, just one quick half sentence, Andrew. Thank you. I think one of the things that we are hearing from the state energy offices as we prepare to begin working with the incoming Biden administration is the importance of a solid market-wide data and analytical work to underpin the kinds of things we've been talking about today. With that information in hand, I think we can speed this process along. Data will guide us and help us make great decisions. So that's a top goal for NASEO.
Right. I did not ask about RD&D, but I do think that's a key piece of this actually, and in partnership with the federal government, as we heard from David NASEO in the previous session. So good stuff. Ed or Regina, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would add, and this goes back to the other thing, is that, as these technologies are developed and adopted, somebody touched on like what would OEMs look like. But even those that are going to actually install it, test procedures and ways to measure those benefits, like Regina said, I think are going to be key going forward. So that's maybe not quite R&D, but that's certainly development work that has to happen, even some research and development work in order to get those technologies to be recognized for what they can provide.
Absolutely. Great. Well, Regina, final word.
Final word, no pressure. Just what Keith said, I think the charter needs to just be broaden and simplify. I think everyone recognizes that some of the constructs do need to be broadened to cover the whole suite of solutions that we can bring to customers and the grid and the environment in general. But of course, with broadening, naturally complexity follows. So I think if we could strike that balance between broadening and simplifying at the same time, I think that will help, stimulate some of the participation and achieve the goals that we're all aiming for.
Great. Well, thank you so much. And I want to just thank all four of you for being with us and giving us your thoughts. Really, this is a very exciting time in the energy sphere, and we have huge challenges. Climate change is here. We really just are facing, to varying degrees, but very clearly, increasing urgency to deal with the impact we're having in our energy systems on our environment, and doing all the other things we've talked about at the same time. So a big optimization problem, but lots of good tools in our toolbox. So thank you all for contributing to this transition and evolution. And we'll take it back to Clay. All right, we're on time. Thank you, sir. Thanks, everyone. Kudos to good conversation. I'm going to give you guys some applause. So thanks. Passing it back to you, Clay.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And thanks to the panel. It was a great discussion. I think back a year when we first introduced active efficiency, and we would spend a lot of time just defining what beneficial electrification is. We'd spend a lot of time describing what GEBs are. We spend a lot of time talking about, integration of DERs. Now, less than a year later, we've just heard a compelling argument by Keith that these are essentially the same thing, that energy efficiency, electrification, grid interactive efficiency buildings all come together to provide a variety of benefits to the grid and to building owners and to communities. So we have come a long way, and I really learned a lot in that panel. So appreciate you all for your comments and input, and Andrew for moderating.